Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to the GMI Rocket Show. Today's episode number 36. I am your host, Roman Zalchenko. I am a former immigration lawyer and now immigration tech entrepreneur, the founder of Laborless, which automates H-1B compliance, and also the founder of GMI Rocket, which brings you this show, among other things. I'm really excited. Our guest today is Amélie-Sophie Vavrovsky. And we're going live late because we were just talking about just the intersection of immigration and technology, and the climate crisis, and I think all of these things are intertwined, and this is going to be such a fascinating conversation around how immigration, first of all, is connected to the climate crisis, really, and then how technology can help solve or alleviate at least some of the issues that arise with that. So I'm really excited for, no need for more of an introduction. Thank you, Amélie, so much for joining, and I'm really, really excited for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Roman. Yeah, likewise. I'm super thrilled. I've loved watching these episodes, and I'm super excited to be part of it today.
Oh man, that's so cool. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's interesting because when you and for me, when I came into the sort of immigration tech field, I came into it from a lawyer's perspective, practicing lawyer's perspective, where I worked with a case management platform, and I was like, oh, right, immigration technology, it's supporting the business of immigration law. But there's so much more to it. And I think for me, what I've loved about this show and just generally this journey that I've sort of been on over the last few years is learning about all the different ways people are using technology to impact the immigration industry, not just in a commercial way, or if it is in a commercial way, not just for business immigration visas, but for so much more. So, whether it's formally, and we'll get to that, of course, your company, or if it's the kind of the facilitation of connecting refugees to high-skilled jobs, things like, and using technology for that. There's so much to it. One thing I do want to say before we jump in, for people who are here and watching, please comment, let us know where you're calling in from, let us know where you are, and definitely ask questions along the way. I think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion. So first of all, Amélie, I realized just now that when I introduced you, I don't even think I mentioned formally. I was still like in the kind of environmental mindset. So, you're the CEO or you're co-founder of Formally, which is an immigration tech company that streamlines immigration forms through using accessible design, which is, we'll get to that. I mean, you don't hear those sort of terms in the same conversation very often, although it is really inherently there, or if it isn't, it should be. So we'll talk about what that means, and we'll talk about sort of what you're doing. But first, always want to start in the beginning and kind of learn a little bit about the person, because the person and what they went through kind of dictates the why of what they're doing. So you have a very colorful and interesting, background. Let's just even pre-college. So can you? And it's not really, even if you go on your LinkedIn profile, you can't tell. You don't know all the places you've lived and sort of experienced in the world. Can you talk a little bit? So where were you born? Let's start there.
I was born in Vienna, in Austria, and my family actually still lives there. So, grew up in Vienna, and I went to French school as a child, though. So I sort of grew up a little interculturally right away. So grew up bilingual, speaking German and French.
Did you go to French school because it was something your family wanted you to do, or like why, I guess?
Oh, it's such a funny story, actually. So my brother, who's about 4 years older than I was, and I used to like play Pokemon cards, and I remember like obsessively memorizing these Pokemon cards, like as a young child. I think I was like 4 or 5. My parents were like, "Oh my God, she needs to learn something more useful than that." So they actually were like, "Oh, she should learn a new language. I think that's going to be a really good skill." So they just like threw me into French school, and it was just like all French day one. But I just like picked it up, and I think that instilled in me like a huge passion for languages, and sort of languages as a way to connect with people. But the reason my parents sent me was like, "Oh, she should really learn something like useful."
Wow, Pokemon cards. That has created you. Pokemon cards is where it all started. How
That's
old were
right.
you when you entered French school?
I was about like five, I think, 4 or 5.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
pretty
Okay.
young.
So, and did they speak German at all in the school too, or it was just all French?
It was all French. So all of my primary school education was in French, and there were some German classes, but it was like taught more like a second language. So
Wow,
that was really funny. Like growing up in Vienna, my parents like speak some French, but not a ton. So I had like French in school and like German at home.
that's amazing. Really, it's usually the opposite.
Yeah,
You know, I grew up speaking Russian, so I speak Russian mostly at home. I never took it in school,
yeah,
but that makes more sense traditionally. But that's actually brilliant because even if you stayed there, you would end up having to live your life basically in German. But then to have that really solid French foundation at least gives you the two languages. Um, so then, okay, so you grew up for at least some time in Austria. You went to French school your whole educational life, like high school and everything,
no,
or
no. So I have a lot of interesting like school stories, but
yeah,
I went to French school until uh, like the end of elementary school, and then I switched to normal Austrian school. But in Austria, they make you learn a lot of ancient languages, so like classic languages like ancient Greek and Latin. And I was like, and the other option was French, and I was like, well, I already like know French fluently, so I don't want to learn that. So there's very few schools in Vienna that teach Russian, but one of them is this like Catholic school that like basically had like wasn't all boys school. Like my year was the first year where they like considered admitting like women and girls. So it was like 3 girls in my class and like a lot of men. And I'm not Catholic either, really. So it was really an interesting experience. And then I finished high school in New Mexico and did some exchanges to France and Russia as well. So
wow.
a little bit all over the place.
So you started basically middle school in this Russian school, also in Vienna.
It was
Uh,
just a normal like Catholic school, but they offered Russian because
Offered
I
Russian.
think they had some connections with some like Orthodox priests in Moscow.
Got it. And how did you find yourself in? You said New Mexico.
Hmm.
How did you find yourself in New Mexico?
I applied to this program called United World Colleges (UWC),
Mhm.
and they have schools all over the world. At the time when I applied, they had like 13 schools, and the one in the U.S. is in New Mexico. So it's this old Jesuit retreat. I think it was actually a railway hotel. It looks like a huge castle in the middle of like the Rocky Mountains, and like you look one way and there's desert forever, and then you look the other way and there's just like mountains forever. And there are hot springs. It was a really crazy place, but it was amazing because there were like 200 students from like 96 different countries, and I think that sort of intercultural or like cross-cultural understanding that was built there was like really formative for me.
That's incredible. And I'm assuming, I mean, your parents obviously let you go. You went alone. I'm assuming not
I
with
went
your,
alone.
yeah. What,
Yeah.
I'm just curious because that's almost, it's brave, I mean, to be kind of, middle teenager and to say, you know what, I'm going to go across the world and live by myself. What kind of drove you, do you think, to do that? Or how did you come across this school?
I was just always really interested in like discovering the world and the people that live in it. And I think my way to connect with the world was through like language. And I don't know, I was just really excited to see what other people from other places thought like what were their like stories, what was their background. And I thought that was a really unique opportunity. And UWC is really diverse in terms of like nationalities, but also like backgrounds, right? So people who come from like really rural places and people who come from like really busy cities. And I thought it was an amazing place. And there's sort of this mission that the school has, which is to work towards peace and a sustainable future. So everybody was an idealist, everybody was dreaming big. And I'm still in touch with a lot of those people. So I think that's really like what drew me to do that. But it was a little scary. My parents are very supportive, but I think they think I'm a little crazy maybe as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's how can you say, if you're able to do it, how do you say no to your child who says, I want to have this incredible life experience? But I can imagine a part of you being like, oh my gosh, we're sending our child off to this faraway land by themselves. It's
Yeah. And
Yeah.
people think it's a cult, people think that, well, college is a cult. Like, I assure you it's not. It's legit. Look it up. But they were like, are you sure this is real? I had to like prove to them that it was.
That's amazing. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, you look at some liberal arts colleges in the US that similarly bring together people who are incredibly passionate and interested, and it's typically small groups and really strong bonds. And, there is this idea of like you come out there full forced into the world, and quote unquote normal people are like, whoa, where did you come from, right? And I can imagine that, but it's wonderful to have these types of organizations to bring together people to like elevate each other's passions by compounding them. Like you're with each other, you're talking, you're ideating. That's super cool. So you finished high school in New Mexico.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah,
got my IB diploma, and then moved on.
And so and then were you here on like a J1 cultural exchange program, or how did that?
No,
we are an immigration.
I've been an F1 student for a long time, and now working on my EB2 and IW.
Wow, fascinating. That's a whole nother part of this conversation.
My own immigration story.
Yeah, your own immigration story. So you came here on an F1, but as a high school student, not as a college, as like a university student.
That's right. And then transferred into university, had my OPT, founded formally on OPT. And yeah, now working towards the green card.
Amazing. So let's talk about that a little bit. So you finished college, you finished high school, you enrolled in Brown, and I think, and you studied Middle Eastern studies, right? And you had
international relations. Yeah.
So like a double major type of situation. Just curious, like from that perspective, what drew you to Brown, and I don't know, what was your experience like there?
What drew me to Brown? I was really excited about Brown's open curriculum. And I think I'm somebody who loves to work interdisciplinarily. And I think actually going to UWC, I think showed me that like problems in the world don't fit into neat little categories anymore, right? You can't just like be a political scientist and like solve all the policy problems, because turns out policy problems are connected to the environment, and they're connected to technology now, and they're connected to all these other things that you need to understand. So Brown seemed to me like an intellectual candy store. It's like you could like study anything. Nobody would like keep you from doing it. Like they really rarely enforce any sort of like real guidelines. So if you want to take like a deep physics class as like a classics major, like you can do that. And there is truly like no restriction and no requirement around that. So that was like an extremely fruitful community for me, and got me into like things like hackathons, right? And to hang out with the computer science like department people. And that was just like a really amazing experience. And I think opened my eyes to the connection of like technology and human rights, which is something I still work on like really intensely at Stanford. I think in our world today, similar to like the problems, like human rights are like digital rights are human rights at this point, right? Because if you think about the way data circulates and the way people exist, you don't really have a complete online separate self from your like physical self. And those two are starting to coalesce into the same thing. And I think that's a really fascinating point in time. And studying those things in conjunction, I think is really exciting and important.
Did you have an idea of where you wanted to go with sort of your career, or were you just thinking, all right, I have the freedom, I'm going to explore? You obviously were interested in multicultural things, and certainly languages. Did Brown introduce you to sort of the technology side of things as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I think part of it was like the computer science department, and part of it was hackathons. But I was always, and I have been working on immigration issues for a really long time. So I came into Brown having already worked on immigration in high school, and having volunteered with refugees like in the Middle East and in other like in Austria and around the world. And I think that was really on my mind. It was like this problem of displacement that seemed to be getting bigger and bigger as we were speaking, right? And I was in school when I was like a junior when Trump was elected. And that was an important moment in immigration for the US, right? Like suddenly things were changing pretty rapidly, and there was the sense that there was a crisis, at least in the asylum space. And I think that really activated me. And I think my policy background taught me that policy can be extremely effective, and I still believe in policy making, but that there was also a need, like a dire need for something that could be built quicker and that could respond to the situation faster. So I think out of that need, the idea for Formally was really born. And then we built V1 at a hackathon, like at Brown my senior year.
That's incredible. Can you talk a little bit of maybe about that hackathon experience? Because hackathons are something that I think the immigration space can benefit from. Get all the minds together and say, all right, let's pick 20 issues in immigration and have people build technology just for it. Obviously, what you did was a little bit more fortuitous because it was, I'm assuming, a hackathon around everything, any topics. I don't know. What was that experience? Can you talk a little bit about like who came up? I mean, what do you remember about that? Did you kind of found this person? You're like, all right, I've got this idea. And they're like, I love it. Here's what I can do. How did that, like, what do you remember about that?
I was honestly shocked that like a product like Formally that would streamline your immigration applications, especially for like refugees and asylum seekers, I was shocked it didn't exist. I was like, how on earth does this not exist? And I also remember this was around the time that I had just filed for OPT for the first time. And even that was so stressful. Like I was so stressed by it. And I speak fluent English, and I had a supportive like international student department like at Brown. And I was like, wow, like that was really stressful. And like eligibility categories don't make any sense to me. And like, how on earth am I supposed to understand this? And this is so important. And I won't know for 3 months if I did it correctly. And there was so much anxiety around it. And I was like, wow, like imagine if like your family's like livelihood really depends on this. Like, what do? You're faced with this like form, you're faced with this like bureaucratic barrier that you feel like you cannot climb yourself because it's available only in English and full with like really legally complex and nuanced terminology. How do you navigate that? Especially if it's so important to get it right? So I think we're like, wow, we need to like try to build this. So yeah, I remember recruiting like some seniors, like fellow senior like friends that I had already had. And I was like, hey, like, why don't we just build it? Why don't we give it a try? And then we won the hackathon, like our project won the hackathon. And we're like, like maybe there's actually something there. Like maybe we should try it. And when I was sort of faced, this was like when I had to make job decisions as well, because it was in like January and then it was like March, we were working on Formally. And I was like, like, I think there's really something there. And this problem is really like much larger than this immediate use case that we were just thinking of. And I think we could solve it. So we started talking to a bunch of organizations and made the decision to work on Formally full time. And then we incorporated while I was on OPT. I was self-employed on OPT, which was really cool and a really fun experience. And I also thought, wow, there really wouldn't be a better way for me to learn more in a year than to just try to create this thing. And I think that realization is something I love to share when I speak to students as well, as like, giving it a shot, like trying something that you're really passionate about, trying to build something, trying to really understand like a user experience and like building a solution for it is such an invaluable experience. And I don't think working for a big company would have given me that experience or that like level of expertise that comes from like having to figure everything out. And that's the secret about startups. Like nobody knows what they're doing when they're going into it, and unless they're like a serial entrepreneur. But for the most part, everybody's figuring it out, right? And everybody's like helping each other and learning from one another. So that's something I loved about it.
What was that first kind of when you launched and you won the hackathon, and it sounds like you were it changed the gear. The gears started to go in the direction of maybe this is what I should pursue rather than looking for a think tank or whatever else you were sort of thinking about. What do you remember about that sort of first year? Because I think you just hit on something really important. Part of the reason for me for starting this show was the idea that when I was building my company and other people, I suppose, were building their company in this space, there wasn't a well of information around technology and immigration. And look, you can pull a lot of great things from other technology entrepreneurs or just other starting things, but there are nuances to immigration that are different. And also knowing who's in this space to look up to or to reach out to would be really valuable. The hope here was, number one, the idea was I want to create the show that I wish, the resource that I wish existed back when I was starting, number one. And then number two, of course, immigration tech is growing. We'll get to your thoughts on that later, but investment is coming in around business immigration and asylum and AI and all these other things, which means that there are really more opportunities. So hopefully people who are watching, who have ideas, don't feel paralyzed by the sort of, not knowing what to do, because to your point, no, none of us knew what to do, and we didn't have the resources that are available now.
I know. I mean, you really created it, I think. Like, as far as I understand immigration legal tech, like it's still small, but it's powerful. But I remember we didn't know what we were. We were like, should we be a nonprofit? Should we be like a for-profit company? And again, my background as a policymaker, studying development, studying impact, understanding how impact happens, it was a really interesting sort of process to come to the decision that we actually didn't want to be a nonprofit, and we didn't want to be a traditional social impact venture either. And the reasoning behind that is that I just believe everybody deserves really good tools. And I think starting in the asylum space is super important. Like, we care about it. My team cares about it. It makes like getting awesome, like brilliant people on the team, like much easier, right? Because we're working towards this like goal that we really care about. But on the other hand, we're solving a really, really hard user design challenge. And I think that's something that the legal space doesn't think about a lot, right? Is like, is your product usable for everybody, right? And not just people who have received training, people who have had to learn the software, right? Like, case management software needs to be learned. And I fully want to unpack that notion, right? And actually, starting in the asylum space made us ask these really deep questions about usability and about accessibility and about how can we design something that is both lightweight, but also thorough and like secure, right? Like, I spend a lot of time studying like security and data privacy, right? So how do we like empower people with their data in a way that makes sense to people who don't speak English and have super limited tech literacy? And I think that really led to some really amazing innovations with Formally. And I think that's actually what makes it really scalable, like as a business moving forward, expanding beyond the immigration space, right? There's so much in the public space, like from healthcare to schools, like so many people approach us being like, this is a huge problem in this field, right? Like, we have such a hard time getting like good quality applications like sent to us. People make a ton of mistakes. Like, it costs a lot of time. There's not enough legal resources. Like, attorneys don't love filling out paperwork. I think this is a secret. I don't know if you agree with me, Roman, but like, I don't think this is why people become lawyers. They're not like, oh, I love I-589s, right? It's like, I like helping people. I like connecting with people. I like advocating for people. And I feel like if we can make really great tools that are really accessible and work for everybody, you can outsource all of that work to like the individual, and they're actually the owners of like that piece of the immigration case. And you can spend your time like actually connecting with your client, actually representing them in court, advocating on their behalf, calling every single organization if you work at a legal aid organization that works with asylum seekers. And I've done this. When somebody comes in with a ready to go Formally application, I'm like, cool, all right, let's review this real quick. And then I have like 3 hours left to call every single organization in San Diego and see if they'll take your MPP case. Like, that is empowering, and that feels good as somebody who is like providing legal assistance. So I think, I don't know, this was a long spiel about it, but that's sort of what really excites me about this space in particular.
I think most immigration lawyers, even those that work on business cases, because at the end of the day, you're helping someone move their family from one to another. You're changing their life. They're setting up a future for their kids that's different. But especially in the more humanitarian side of things, I think, of course, the immigration space is in a way unique because these are some of the best lawyers out there, and the non-lawyers, the sort of the consultants, the other people around the world who do immigration work. But if we're just talking about the U.S., immigration lawyers here are incredibly passionate, regardless of their specialty within the industry. Of course, we don't want to do forms. The only reason we need to do we do forms is because we need to, and we have to make sure that the forms are filled out correctly, and
That's right.
to your point, walk our the clients through the process. I have my own thoughts, and I think it depends on the type of case, the type of technology you're talking about. If we go back and think about immigration technology, as far as I understand, mostly it started out as geared towards the lawyers. So lawyers still delivered their service the same way, but it was geared towards the lawyers. It didn't have a sort of user experience frame of reference. It was just, you're digitizing this process. You know the terminology, you understand the workflow, you can figure it out. And then anything downstream from that, you're going to do as usual. So walk your clients through it. And then the idea of a client portal, if you will, came in after the fact, right? Because they realized these things you're talking about, they've realized. But the problem, I guess, is that when you've built the software, I mean, it's, you know, things can change, but when you've built software centered on the immigration attorney as a service provider and not centered around the ultimate beneficiary of the immigration application, it's just patently different.
It totally is.
And so
we built the other way around, right? Like we built the client side first, and then now we also have an attorney side that allows you to manage accounts in a really clean, really easy way. But again, that required starting with users and like clients, and not actually, we didn't build the attorney platform until much later.
So let me ask you this. Tell me about, or you know, in general, let's talk about what is Formally. So we've talked about it, how it started, you know, your goals with it. What is it? What can people expect if they were to just try to learn more about Formally? What can they expect to learn?
Yeah, so Formally, like really the core product guides applicants through the entire application process, right? So let's take an asylum application. So a client can choose a language they're comfortable in. We have all the questions translated for them. They can go through them. Say they fill it out in Spanish, right? We take them through it in like a smart, intelligent way. We don't ask you like, check this box if you also want to apply for withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture first, which is currently the first question on the I-589. We ask them like, hey, like, what should we call you? Like, what's your name? And we guide them through these questions one at a time, and we provide context at every single step of the way. So we cannot provide legal advice, but we can give context, right? So if the context necessary is like, you know, if the question is, are you fluent in English? The real context that's important is like, make sure that you actually are fluent in English, because the implication or like the consequence might be that you may give up your right to have an interpreter present during your court proceedings, right? So we're not guiding the client either way. We're not saying like, don't say you're fluent or say you're fluent. It's just like, this is why this context matters, right? And actually that's in the instructions for the I-589. If you dig through the USCIS instructions, like that sort of context is there, but I think that's where Formally provides value. And then we encourage clients to sort of start thinking about like their stories for the Part B for the I-589. We help them upload all the required documents. So we built a really accessible interface that works on mobile and works on like Chromebooks and desktops. We generate the entire form. We automatically put all the NAs everywhere, and we generate a PDF that is editable in a web browser, which is honestly something we found revolutionary for attorneys, because they have so many like compatibility issues with Adobe Acrobat. So you can edit it on any device. It's really editable. You can print and download the form, and you can also generate forms for dependents automatically. So we compile the entire application, we bundle it, and then we send it to the attorney for review. And the way the attorney accesses it is there's like 3 levels, right? So there's the individual account that the user has where they have all their information, all their supporting documents. There's also a secure messaging system where you can talk to your attorney that is linked to an attorney account, and the attorney can drop into their client accounts, right? So it's sort of a little bit of a reimagined way. And if you're an organization, you have multiple attorneys. The attorneys each have their clients. And then from the organizational level, you also have access to all the attorney accounts. But all the work actually happens in the client's account. So the attorney just has the ability to approve, to make notes, to make edits, but the client always has the newest version. And most importantly, they can actually read their own forms. So Formally automatically translates answers into English, but there you can also view all the answers in Spanish. So if you have to go and represent yourself after working with a legal aid organization, you can actually go to court and read your own forms, which is not how things are right now. So I think that's a huge step towards like empowerment and accessibility. And then after you're done with your immigration case, Formally actually, and that's something we're planning on expanding in the future, helps you like file your employment authorization. And because we already know all that information, we just grab it, we pre-populate it, and it doesn't take any time, right? And then we're like, oh, and also, by the way, did you make sure your address is up to date? We have attached those change of address form in case you need. Oh, and also here's a fee waiver for your I-765. You know, so kind of what TurboTax does for taxes, we do for the immigration space, but we know that this modular, like this like flexible form of data that stays with the client is going to be like hugely helpful for any other subsequent bureaucratic process. So there's like value that stays with the client.
Do you, I mean, it's incredible. And I think it's also cool that you mentioned the case, the actual application lives within the, beneficiary, the applicant's account, I guess. And then the lawyer who effectively, I assume they sort of authorized to be their attorney can then go in and make changes or updates or suggestions or whatever. But it lives with the individual rather than with the organization, who, if you want to go to another client, you have to be like, hey, can I get my forms? Can I get this?
That's right.
Where you actually own it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the client owns all of it, and the attorney has access to it. Attorneys have access to their clients, but it makes approving really easy because the attorney dashboard is like, hey, approve like Roman's form, right? And then they just drop you into it. You can just like check off on everything. You can make notes, and then you're done, right? But there's no version control. There isn't like version 7.1, right? Like the client always has the newest version. And for like remote legal assistance, it's revolutionary because the client can actually see what you're doing. So it actually is almost like a Google Doc in that way.
And what languages, I think what languages are you currently operating in?
We're currently supporting all the official UN languages. So that's French, English, Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, and Arabic.
Got it. Yeah. That's, and that covers a huge population of the world. So I suppose that's amazing. And I guess, well, let's chip in. We got a couple of comments, so I thought maybe we'd just jump into that.
Awesome.
Marianne said intellectual candy store. Yeah, love that. And Marianne also says you've thought of everything. I love that. And thank you, Shiv, who was agreeing with something you said earlier for chiming in. Thank you, Shiv. Nice to see you here. A question here from Josh Shacknow says, this sounds incredible. Would love to hear what your V1 looked like. What was the evolution of the software over time?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think, Roman, you touched on this, right? Like if client portals are an afterthought for case management, that's exactly where we started. And we started by like really just researching the most important context. So a bunch of it was actually my research abilities at the beginning, right? So we were like, all right, we're going to make we're going to make human-made translations for all the questions. We're going to use machine translation to safeguard privacy for translating answers back into English. And we did a bunch of research, like what context matters. We asked so many attorneys, like, what is important to know about this form, right? Like, what do you tell your clients in the training you do? And we tried to capture all of that in the user experience. And then after that, it became clear that attorneys really needed a way to manage client applications. And if we wanted to build a software for, say, nonprofit organizations, legal aid organizations, they needed a way to like manage clients. And we had a lot of interesting conversations where they were like, this could be really interesting in terms of like direct and indirect impact numbers, right? So let's say we have like 300 people that need help, but we can only help 100. If we can provide like lightweight support through them, right, by giving them an access code to the software, we can sort of provide this light touch assistance that we weren't able to provide initially. So we built all these functionalities into it. And I think we were looking for magic moments for attorneys. One magic moment is editable PDFs, like fully editable PDFs. People were like, whoa. And they were like, oh, we really want like NAs filled everywhere because USCIS requires that from us. And then we had another one, which was people were like, oh my God, we're literally hand copying dependent forms right now. So a lot of legal aid organizations work on pen and paper, and they have like people who don't speak Spanish who copy the forms for all the kids and all like the spouse, et cetera. So when we made the auto-generate dependent form, like that was a magic moment. So I think we just started building as we were testing, and then COVID pushed us to like, work with organizations that now had to provide assistance remotely. So I think that like shaped a lot of the new functionalities and features that we started adding. But I think what's interesting about our process is that we're so focused on keeping everything clean. And I think we had a lot of insights about attorneys' use of case management software where they're like, there are all these features that we never use, that we really don't need, that take a long time to learn, and we really don't want them there. So I think we take a really long time to really think like, is this really necessary? Is this going to create a magical moment for the attorney? Is this going to create a magical moment for the client? So I think that goes into every part of the iteration process.
Well, and that brings up such a great point. And I was going to ask you that. I mean, it sounds like well, let me ask you this. What comes first? The magic moment from the attorney in terms of what they want, or is it their sort of desires and then you build it in, and once they see the feature, Is that the magic moment? And I ask this because, every single person who uses your platform, I'm sure, will have their own desires and their own opinions about what's good and what's not.
Yeah.
And I think when you run a software company, you have to decide. I mean, if you have a high enough volume, then you could say, all right, if 100 people have asked for this, we should probably bump it up, but sometimes the point is, maybe you don't know. Maybe there's something that only one person just thought of. Nobody else has thought of it. But that thing would be a magic moment for everybody. So what's your process? How do you decide what to add so that you don't become this sort of conglomeration of unused, tools?
Yeah. So I think we ask about feedback a lot, right? Like we always ask what's working, what's not working. We also have to some extent, limited development capacity. So I think we have to be really thoughtful about everything we develop. And we have a really high standard for design and actually implementing that feature. So I think, like you said, you have to be really smart about what you build into the software that feels like a magic moment. I remember the copying forms. That was actually an insight I had from volunteering with an organization. Nobody told me this. I don't think people knew this, how big of a pain it was. It wasn't verbalized, right? But there were two things I realized when I volunteered with that organization. One is there were people doing data entry, which to me is crazy, right? So people fill out a intake form, and then there's actual volunteers whose sole purpose is to do data entry into a platform that is never seen by the user, right? That's just for internal nonprofit use. So there's no way to put data from the form. And the other one was that they were hand copying forms, and that people made mistakes when copying them, right? So I was wow, we need to find a way to auto-generate that. So I think that was a non-verbalized need. But then other things we need to be able to transfer clients from one attorney to the next. That just kept coming up and coming up again and again. So we're all right, we're going to build this feature. So there's definitely a healthy mix of things. But sometimes I think my volunteer experience is really what brings out these issues, right? Looking at it from a volunteer perspective, and you're that is wild that's how things are right now. And feeling empowered to create something that can change it is I don't know, it gets me super excited. I'm wow, we can totally build this.
And it also, I think, it impacts your conviction that the thing you're building is good because it's personally touched you in some way. Yeah. And it's not this thing of someone telling you that they'd like to see this and you're not sure. It's this other alternative reality of no, I did this, I hated it, or I witnessed it and it was crazy. Right. And I don't need to ask 100 people. I just know that it has to happen.
Exactly. Yeah, I was I can't believe people can't read their own forms after they leave, right? Because I would sit down with this client and I would be all right, take your phone out, put on the recording. I'm going to read it to you in Spanish. I know it says it here in English, but I'm going to read your supplement B statement to you in Spanish. So you know what it says when you go to court in 3 months. And when you're working with NPP clients, their court date might not be for another year. Right. So what do you think the chances are, especially when you talk about folks who have suffered from trauma? Trauma memory doesn't work linearly. Where do you think that puts people? What position does that put them in if they have a form they can't read and they have to go to court with it, representing themselves?
And you might fill out the form with them. You might spend your time and explain to them in detail what it means. What's the likelihood that they'll remember every detail, every important detail, even if it's a month out, forget about a year out, right?
Exactly. So that we called it the Ver en Español feature. That was huge for us. We were we need to build this. People need to be able to read their own forms after they have been finalized by the attorney.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Frankly, that sort of mindset should be applicable not just in the more humanitarian-based immigration space. I think it should be everywhere. If you're applying for something, you should have resources at your fingertips. If you have a court date or anything else, you should be able to pull things up quickly and get information. Yeah, that's amazing. A question here from Marianne, which we didn't really touch on, but I think is an interesting one. How did you decide on the name Formally or Formally?
We were called Immigrate at the hackathon, and a bunch of organizations are called Immigrate. And we're nah. So we're oh, maybe Emmy. And then we really didn't like it. We didn't think it was building trust. And then we brainstormed with the early team, and I think we came on Formally. And I like puns. I like dad jokes and I like puns. And I thought formally had a pun in it because of the form ally part, but we didn't want to make it uh, too obvious. But I think formally is easy to say. It works in different languages, right? That was another criterion. Like you can say formally, you can say formally, like it kind of works in lots of different languages. It's easy to pronounce. And we like the idea of being an ally to people. And formally yours is like kind of funny too. It like establishes, I think, some sense of trust. And then the bird was important to us because people should be able to migrate and like move, and birds are peaceful but also powerful. Formerly Birdie, she's quite powerful, but we like that symbolism for our company as well.
I'm curious, actually, is there a specific type of bird that the Formerly logo is, or no?
We haven't like picked a specific type of bird. I think I think it was, I should ask my designer, but I think it was a seagull, actually, because we actually thought they're kind of majestic and they're like everywhere and they're amazing and really cool. But I don't know. It might also have been an eagle, so I don't care. It's like a bird.
Yeah,
but she's a she.
Yeah, nice. I love it.
Maybe she's an albatross.
Yeah. That's I love that. Yeah, it's interesting. The bird analogy comes up quite often in the immigration space. They're beautiful migratory creatures that have the freedom of the skies that human beings, with our infinite wisdom, don't have very often.
I know. And from an intellectual perspective, as somebody who studies like policy and sociology, like to me, there is a fundamental disconnect about the way we thought about globalization in terms of mobilizing capital. But for some reason, we haven't mobilized the movement of people. And to me, that doesn't make sense, right? Like, why can money move so freely? Why have we globalized everything about the global economy, but we haven't really thought about mobilizing people in the same way? So from an intellectual perspective, I think that's interesting as well.
I want to talk about that a little bit because, I have this question of like, where's Formally the organization heading, or where do you think it's heading? But before we get into that, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, and we talked a little bit about this before we went live. What's your vision? Because your vision is somewhat different, or it's like you said, multidisciplinary. What's your vision for what's important, or what's going to become more important vis-a-vis immigration in the world? Where do you think we should be putting our energy as people who quote unquote advocate for immigration in general? And let's start there. What do you think? What do you think that is?
I think there's two, actually maybe three big important trends that I see. And to give people some background, I'm getting a graduate degree in international and tech policy on one hand, and I'm doing another one in environment and resources. And the three buckets are really, on one hand, I think climate change and migration patterns are like going to change due to like climate displacement, resource scarcity, conflict, honestly, that happens over resources. So there's going to be mass displacement especially if we are not able to get a handle on the climate crisis. So displacement is going to be expected to go up by a lot over the next few years. So looking out for that and finding innovative solutions to make it able for people, to enable people to move from place to place, to help nations build capacity, to help nations welcome people who are displaced, right? So my work in government and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we think about these things, like how do you welcome somebody successfully? How do you think about integration? How do you think about, accepting people on the move? And that's going to be a question for a really long time. And that's going to become even more important. I think the other part is really around technology and data, right? So data privacy, data ownership, and using technology increasingly, right? Really fully going through the industrial revolution in the legal space, right? I think it's inevitable that things are going to be digitized, but I think there isn't enough thought placed on how secure are the systems we use for ransomware attacks, right? So that's the other big thing I study is data privacy and security. And, a lot of systems are not. A lot of attorneys still use Google Drive. And, even if you just do an open source like investigation and you look for a file type Google Doc and like name of a person or passport picture or passwords even, you'd be surprised what you can find. So thinking about safeguarding information and data, I think is going to be really, really important. And I think the last one is this trend in like accessibility and design. And I think that's really about accessible design being good design. You know, I think people like to think as accessibility as this niche, it's this niche topic that is important for people like who have certain like challenges specific to them. But think about how many times you struggle with a technology because it's just not working for you, because there's just too much stuff on the screen, because it's just not working in the right way. You can't click on the things you want to click. It's slow, it's clunky, and probably also susceptible to ransomware attacks. But I think we have to think about making accessible design a core part of everything we do in legal technology. So I think those are like the three trends I see.
You know, I just had really an argument, and I felt bad because the person I was talking to was a support person. This person who it was a platform that I signed up with, and it was just awful. Like, and I talked to and I was like, you guys have millions of dollars in funding. I'm paying you, and I can't. I'm not stupid. Like, I might not be a genius, but I'm not stupid. Where is this thing that I want? Why are there 15 options? And so I think to myself, if this really commercial enterprise, which is built around extracting money from me for their services, if they can't get design right, how can we assume that, you know, technology solutions that are really going after like a have a non-commercial goal, or if it's a commercial goal, it's going after people who might not be, you know, might be exhibiting some sort of challenges of some sort, like demographic that maybe is not wealthy or whatever. How do I assume that those people care? I mean, in a way, I guess maybe people who are building technology in that sense are so passionate that like they'll just build the best thing. But overall, from just an economic standpoint, if the demand for that service isn't as great, and if the price isn't as high, you know, the classical economic assumption is that it's not going to be as good. And I think, but I think,
well, let me challenge that for you.
Yeah, please.
Because, you know, at the very core of what we do is this belief that everybody deserves amazing tools. And on one hand, that's great for humanity. That's great for people. Like, people really like good, well-designed, easy to use tools. But on the other hand, if you think about the time you spend agonizing over things that don't work, this time you need to spend to input all the information on your client's behalf, if you like think about all that time, your time is really valuable, and attorney time is especially valuable, and it's scarce, right? And it's worth like hundreds of dollars. So from an economic sense, like in perspective, it just makes a ton of sense to build systems that like just work and make things easier for people, because it allows you to outsource things like form completion, application preparation, whatever you need to do, like uploading supporting documents, like transferring it from one system to the next, downloading it from Google Drive, re-uploading it. Like, that's time, and that time truly is money. And if you think about that, think about the hours you're saving, like for an immigration attorney especially, that's a really exciting prospect, right? Like, imagine if instead of spending like 15 hours per case, like prepping it because of all the paralegal time and all the paperwork you need to prep, you actually just spend an hour, and you can still charge per case. Like, you could take on more clients, or you could lower your price and be more competitive, right? But like, it opens a huge array of opportunities. And even on the public sector level, if you think about the amount of money that governments spend, including USCIS, including like courts, on like poorly done applications that they have to send back, right? They have to request more evidence. They have to like do all of these things. Like, that's expensive. So it just makes economic sense. And like human-centered design and design that is accessible will reduce that number of like that error and that like time spent agonizing over like, oh my God, like when we're finally going to get this done with. And how much do you enjoy filling out like PDF forms? Like, how many times, like how on earth has that not been solved, right? Like, if I go to the DMV, I have filled out every single thing that's on that form a million times. Like, why don't I have a tool that just like pre-populates it for me, you know? So I think that's actually one place we're seeing formally go, is like formally as a digital passport that stays with you, right? Stays with individuals, and that you can just like use to pre-populate any piece of information, and a place where your data is actually securely encrypted, like end to end at rest, where you have all your important legal documents and your important, like paperwork in a way that is flexible and can be used for other PDFs. And I think the PDF technology we've developed is really groundbreaking in that way, because PDFs are the worst, right? So I think having cracked how to fill out PDFs really well actually opens the door for a huge variety of applications.
So I think that's a really, really nice segue into what do you see the future of formally being, right? Because clearly you're starting, I mean, you have your own immigration experience, you have your experience working in the immigration, volunteering in the immigration industry. You're tackling this issue of asylum-based or refugee-based applications and making them better. But clearly the whole world is your oyster in terms of, you could be, to your point, you could be DMV focused, you could be, just anything, right? So what do what's the kind of moonshot vision, I guess, and maybe how do you see that progressing in the next, some reasonable amount of years?
Yeah, I'm like, with my background of knowledge, working on like digital human rights, anti-surveillance, encryption, data privacy, all of those things, but also legal technology and immigration, I'm really passionate about equipping people with like a formally tool that works for all sorts of bureaucratic processes, right? So like I said, if you want to sign up your kid for school, if we already have all this information from an asylum application, for instance, right, and you want to sign them up to go to school locally, and you have the like school PDF, I want to be able to just pre-populate it and make it super easy and actually give them advice and be like, oh, by the way, did you know you could also sign up for like free lunch program because you're eligible, right? And the reason that's so exciting to me is because I understand policy and I understand systematic oppression and how that works, right? So if you're somebody who needs food stamps, you're also probably not somebody who's the most likely to know exactly where they are or who to petition or where to get the right form or how to fill it out, right? So in that way, knowing how to how to navigate a bureaucratic system empowers you tremendously. And if you have a tool for you to do that, if you can hack this bureaucracy, the resources available to you are going to be much more ample, right? Making sure you know that you're eligible for unemployment benefits, making sure you're eligible for anti-eviction policies that are happening during coronavirus. It doesn't matter, right? But the policy world is so vast and there's all these government programs that aren't reaching people. So I think if you can put a tool into people's hands that like works for them, that's accessible, that's easy to use, that like makes it super easy to file that thing and send it off, I think you can do a lot of good. And that's because it's tied to policy and it's tied to processes. And because I understand that connection, I think I'm super excited about it.
So do you envision a world where formally does go beyond, genuinely goes beyond immigration and sort of is the central hub of sort of people's data in a way that allows them to navigate life, especially when it has to do with applying for things? Do you see a future like that?
Yeah, I totally do. I think we're going to stay in the immigration space for a little while. I think it's an amazing space. And I think there's still a lot to be done, right? From like DACA to like green cards to like founder visas, I think are a huge topic, right? And H-1Bs like you do. All of those things are really important. But I think after that, we're super excited. And we're getting requests, right? Like cities are asking us for this, like counties are really interested in this. And I think, that's something we're going to start moving as we go.
We've got a question here from Samir Kedekar, probably tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but asking, will you have the opportunity to work with CIS to help them learn how to design their forms? I hope so. But,
there's a fun story around that. I think USCIS tried to digitize their forms at some point, and they spent $2 billion of it, on it. And then I think at the end they had 3 digitized forms or something. Yes, I would love that, Samir. If you have any connections, I'd be your girl.
Yeah, if you also think about the fact that these are our tax dollars that are being spent totally ineffectively to try and do something that, folks in the quote unquote private sector can do much more quickly, much better, much more effectively. So just as an aside, in the H-1B space, the Department of Labor rolled out this tool called FLAG, the Foreign Labor Application Gateway. And they spent, the information's out there. There's I forget the division of the department, but it's like their budgeting department. You could see what the government spends their money on, who the subcontractors are, who the subcontractors are.
Right.
And it's just interesting that there are just companies that traditionally always subcontract with the government. They might know nothing about the subject matter, but they're like with whatever. I don't know how it works. And they come out, and then we're all like upset that, like remember the Obamacare site like crashed, when we had this thing with USCIS or DOL, and it's like, hi, like we're here. We're all working on this specific thing. Yeah. I almost wonder if maybe there's another layer of this, which is, how do we make it easier for organizations like you and I and others who are working on these particular topics specifically? How do we make it easier for us to engage with the government and be in the running for a contract rather than the same old contractor that just like does a mediocre job at best,
I don't know. I don't really have the answer to that, but I know that government contracting is its whole own thing that is really messy and complicated. But yeah, if we can crack that, maybe you and I should work on that. I think that would be really interesting.
Well, I think this is where interdisciplinary work comes into play, because if this is why I love doing this show, even knowing people and being able to connect them in mutually beneficial ways. Like, you might be here and you have the perfect solution for the person here, but if you don't combine,
that's right.
You don't interconnect, it's not gonna, it's not gonna happen. So I guess I want to ask you maybe one particular question with respect to the environmental push for immigration. Do you think that's going to be a global issue? I mean, it is already a global issue. Do you see formally expanding outside the US? I mean, you're obviously already working in multiple languages, so you have that translation piece down. Is there a global opportunity for, what you're thinking and what you're building?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest, and we've gotten foreign governments actually contacting us about it. I think there's huge interest in it, right? Again, because it saves the government like millions of dollars to have a system that works, right? I mean, in Greece right now, people have to like fill out paper forms in Greek and then mail them to the government. Like, I cannot imagine that from a government perspective that like that's effective or like cost effective on any level, really. Right. So absolutely. I think that's something I'm really interested in. I think it's something that's like down the path. And I think we'll probably have to partner with some local folks to get it done. But it totally is scalable. And I think that's the beautiful thing about, technology and SaaS platforms. And like they really are quite scalable. And that really excites me. So yeah, absolutely. I think taking my like international experience and expanding formally internationally would be really exciting for me.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's such an opportunity to deliver really, really kind of useful design elements to processes all over the world, to people all over the world. It's so fascinating, right? It's like it's one of these things where when you see something after you've built it and you look around to the rest of the world, and you're like, guys, it's right here. Why don't you why is this so difficult? Just make a better, whatever. It's so funny. And I think this goes back to education and sort of normalizing, everyone's busy. And it's like, if lawyers, let's just say immigration lawyers for, as an example, they're busy, they're tired, they're stressed. They also run businesses, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. They need to think about that bottom line. And so just the idea of using technology is sort of just, I think, starting to sink in kind of in. But now you're introducing this other thing of like, all right, not only should you be using technology, you should also be discerning as to what technology you're using. Here are some design principles you should know. And if the tool you're using doesn't follow them, then maybe consider another tool. The challenge for me is that it's like, that's another thing for them to learn and internalize and then have to sort of digest, right?
Yeah.
And I just feel like the biggest hurdle for any of these sort of innovative ideas that should be more widespread is lack of education, I suppose, or lack of, normalization. And my question is always, how do we get there? I talked to another founder of an immigration tech company the other day, and we had a similar discussion. And, he was like, well, what else are you going to build and how far are you going to go? And I was like, for Laborless, right? And I was like, look, man, we've built a great product. It's niche. We do a certain thing really well. I have a lot of opportunities to grow, and make the product bigger and better and maybe tackle more things. But the reality is that as is, there are still so many people who can get so much benefit out of it. And so the question becomes, do you just keep building and building and building? Or do you take what you have and educate, normalize what's there? Once that whole population is educated, then you push the product further, right?
Yeah.
And so I always think about that's why, in part, why I do this show, right? I should be doing sales right now. I should be out there marketing, but I feel we need to spread the word.
Absolutely.
It's not really a question. It's just me getting out there. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? How do you want to spread that? Or you talk a lot, you do a lot of presentations with Stanford and elsewhere. I don't know. What do you feel? What should we do? What do we do?
I think spreading awareness is hugely important right now. I think we're working on something really hard. It's a really established space, and we're working with amazing attorneys who are also really critical thinkers, right? Who don't take your word for everything. I think you need to really prove that you are delivering value, that you are delivering value in a responsible way, that you're considering negative externalities, right? And I think that's hard, right? It's not selling dog food, right? Where your dog needs food, therefore dog food. But it's I think a little bit more complex than that, and it's a little bit more nuanced. So I love talking to students and at Legal Tech Fora or podcasts like this one, because I fully agree with you. I think there's a lot of educating that needs to be done, and a lot of minds that need to slightly change their perspectives on things like accessible design, right? Which doesn't maybe sound so sexy, because you're what? You want me to design something that's just accessible? I really care about it looking good, or I really care about it looking sleek, or it just needs to work, right? But I think once you start unpacking the whys and getting deeper into the why that actually is or should become the norm, why accessible design should be the norm, because it works for more people and because it has all these financial benefits as well, I think then you can actually start to make deep change as well.
I love it. I totally agree. One last question for you, and that is, I guess, more of so you speak. How many languages do you speak?
8 to 9, depends on what you count.
Yeah, if I dropped you off in a country where they speak that language, would you survive on all 8 or 9? All right, I'd say you speak them. If you can say more than this is a book and where's the library, I think you're good. I don't know if this is even a possible question to answer, but do you have a favorite word in any of these languages? It could be funny or different or weird, but I know there are,
That's such an interesting question. Let me see. I think there are a lot of really beautiful words out there. In German, there's this word sympathisch, which doesn't mean sympathetic, or it just means somebody who's really good, a nice person, you like them right away. I think that's a great word. I was trying to explain it to my friends the other day, and they're because when you say, oh, he's a nice guy, it's not really nobody really just wants to be nice, but sympathisch means they're really likable. I want to be their friend. They give me a warm, fuzzy feeling. I think I really like that word. But I'm fascinated with Arabic and have been for a while. And that's because of the way the language is structured. So in Arabic, every single word can be distilled to a 3-letter root, and you can insert those roots into different patterns. So you can use the root for learning and insert it into the pattern for building and make a school. And I think that's so cool. So it's really complicated, but highly recommend Arabic in general.
That's fascinating. Yeah. It's really cool to learn about how different languages are structured, and maybe in part what that means about their society and how they think.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
That's super cool. I love it. And, to me, that ties back into the immigration side of things, because, moving around the world and meeting people from around the world in a way is how you learn about different languages and cultures. I mean, YouTube's great. I mean, I love it. I love the internet.
Yeah.
But there's still something about being around the world and being able to move and meet people who have moved,
For sure.
which is wonderful. Hopefully we'll get back there soon, post-COVID. So
I know, getting those vaccines, man.
those shots. Well, Amélie, thank you so much. This was lovely and wonderful. Appreciate, I mean, everything you're doing is super inspiring, and, you know, this intersection of policy and immigration and technology, and of course, sustainability and the environment comes into play. There's so much to do, and there's so much work to be done.
Yeah.
So thank you for what you do, but also thank you for being here and for sharing everything with us.
Thanks so much, Roman. This was really fun, and thank you so much for hosting this show. It's like I said, you're really making that immigration tech community, and I would be so excited to just continue connecting with everyone, because I think together we can really make a huge change.
Amen. How can people reach out to you, by the way, before we go?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I'm super LinkedIn friendly, just like you get, like you are. And you can also check out our website at formally.us.
Awesome. Cool. You've heard it here first, not first, but you heard it here. All right. Well, thank you, Amélie. Have a wonderful weekend, and super grateful for you being here.
Thanks, Roman. Talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here, for your comments. I didn't get to read all of them because a lot of them were just oohs and ahs and just really nice commentary. But I thank you all for joining and for being part of this discussion. Really inspiring. And, you know, I don't talk about this very often, but the environmental impacts of everything that we do, both as sort of individuals and as a society, do have impacts on, you know, what's going to happen in terms of immigration. So keep that in mind. Maybe in a future life, I will be more of a an outward tree hugger, perhaps on social media. Not right now, but keep all that in mind. Keep your eyes open in terms of, you know, learning about immigration patterns and how that impacts the industry and how that impacts people. And let's keep brainstorming of how technology can help all of this in the end. So peace out, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great weekend, and hopefully see you here next Friday.